And thank you for joining me today, Alex.
It's a pleasure, though it is always sad to reflect on the terrible circumstances. And I must start by just offering my condolences and commiserations to all those who are suffering and dying in this senseless war and this savage famine, and all those who have not got news of their friends and relatives in Tigray.
Yes, it's very sad indeed. So, Alex, in the I think last year when I had you last in my show, I asked you a very hypothetical question. I asked you what it would do to bring an end to the war if you had a magic wand. And you told me that you would bring all the belligerents to your room, and then you would make them understand that war is not the way to solve, and that they should sit down and find a peaceful resolution. And I think different actors in the international community have been trying to do that, of course, without the magic wand. And I think it's fair to say that they have failed in achieving that. And indeed, you wrote an article about 2 weeks ago saying that the US has failed in bringing about a peaceful resolution. Why do you think is it that the international community has miserably failed in achieving that?
It hasn't really tried, is the answer. The African Union has essentially been captured by the government in Addis Ababa. We always knew it would not have much autonomy from its host country, which can put a great deal of pressure on it. And that is what we've seen. We've seen General Olusegun Obasanjo in post as the High Representative of the African Union Commissioner for 13 months, during which time he has not managed to achieve a single face-to-face meeting between the parties. He has been extremely lackadaisical, clearly partisan, and the suspicion lingers that his agenda is really to smooth the way for the Ethiopian government, hand in hand with the state of Eritrea, to impose a settlement on Tigray at the point of a gun. This reality was, I think, recognized by the United States. But the US efforts have been extremely low level and half-hearted. And they've been even lower level and less than half-hearted since the war in Ukraine began. So the issue of the war in Ethiopia has essentially been delegated to the Africa department in the Department of State, where it has not been handled in an energetic, impartial, or even professional manner. And one of the consequences of that is that the preliminary understandings, even agreements that were reached between the government of Tigray and the federal government of Ethiopia in meetings, face-to-face meetings facilitated by the United States, have not been kept. The promises have been broken, and there has been no penalty on the government of Ethiopia for breaking those promises. So at the moment, the diplomatic channels are pretty much at a dead end. The African Union is talking about inviting the parties to peace talks in South Africa in about a week's time. But there's no evident serious preparation for those peace talks, and it will be very surprising to me if they're handled in an impartial, credible, robust, serious manner.
Yeah, indeed. I think you will have read that Mike Hammer now is in South Africa or Kenya, trying to summon as much support as possible to the African Union. They still seem to believe, the US and the European Union, and we'll come later to the text that you have annotated, powerful text that you have created last week. But he, at the very least, Mike Hammer seems to be trying to convince African countries to support Olusegun Obasanjo. What is your sense of what he's trying to do now? Is it going to be a case of business as usual, or you think he will have learned some lessons and is trying new things now?
We shall see. I mean, if if you were to take an ABC of mediation, the A is that the mediator needs to be accepted by both parties, and General Obasanjo has not been accepted by the government of Tigray. And that in any normal scenario of conflict resolution, he would be removed. And if one party objects, it doesn't have to explain. You know, if any mediation, any commercial mediation, any family mediation, any mediation between political parties or states, the basic principle is that the mediator has to be accepted by both. And if that's not the case, it's very unlikely that the mediation is going to proceed. The US government and the government of Tigray were very clear in their formulation that it was an African Union-led mediation, and that the question of who would, within the African Union, who would lead it, this has not been resolved. African Union-led means that there would be Africans in the lead, mandated in some manner by the African Union institutions, notably the Peace and Security Council. What we saw in the Security Council last week was when the Security Council began to debate this in an informal manner, the African countries came with the position that this should not be a matter for the UN at all. It's not a matter of international peace and security, it's purely a matter for the AU to resolve without the involvement of others. And the General Obasanjo was invited to address the UN, and he declined. Now, what this implies is that that Obasanjo is going to go ahead with his own plan, which is not an AU-led mediation. It is a mediation led by General Obasanjo and the African Union Commission, without reference to the basic standards of mediation and the norms, principles, and institutions of the African Union. And if I could make a comparison, 10 years ago, there was an African Union-led effort at resolving the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan. It was led by an African Union panel, which worked in very close coordination with the UN, the UN Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, Haile Menkarayzz, the chair of Tghat, then Meles Zenawi, and the United States Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, who was in weekly, sometimes daily communication with the US Secretary of State. That was an African Union-led African solution, which came up with a series of agreements between Sudan and South Sudan, fully backed by the AU, by the UN, by the United States, and by other international parties, including China and Russia. It was problematic, but it was an example of the type of effort that is possible, that constitutes that AU-led effort that I think many had in mind. What we are facing at the moment is something very different, with very little coordination, very little respect for the norms, principles, institutions, and practices of the African Union as enshrined in its foundational charter, the African Peace and Security Architecture. And in contrast to what was happening in Sudan 10 years ago, Sudan, South Sudan, ignoring the UN Security Council. One of the keys to the success, such as it was, of that AU-led effort was very close coordination between the African Union Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council.
Well, so the Tigray government has gone to great length to make distinction between AU-led process, saying that they don't have any problem with an AU-led negotiation process, and Olusegun Obasanjo-led process. And they said that Obasanjo clearly, blatantly is biased and has other problems, and therefore that it wouldn't be something that they would accept. And in fact, your colleague Professor Mulgeta Gebrehewot, wrote a powerful article last year making the case for what an ideal mediator should have, and also making the point that Olusegun Obasanjo doesn't have any of those qualities, including impartiality and fairness and all the other things that you just mentioned. But it does look like that the plea and the argument from the Tigray government has been thoroughly ignored by the international community. And I think part of the reason could be a point that you make in one of your articles lately, which is that the Tigrayans are not being taken seriously, which I think is a really, really pertinent point. And I would like you, Alex, to expand on that. What you mean when you say the Tigrayans aren't being taken seriously, and why you think that is the case, despite, I think, a reasonable conclusion would have been that they should have been taken seriously. They have earned the right to be taken seriously, but that's not happening. And why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think the most striking example of Tigray not being taken seriously is on September 8th to 9th, a high-level delegation from the government of Tigray attended the peace talks in Djibouti, and immediately thereafter issued a statement including a call for a mutually agreed cessation of hostilities leading to a peace process. And that was immediately welcomed and endorsed by the United States, by the UN, and indeed by the AU. Nothing was received from the government of Ethiopia, apart from a vague statement that they would go anywhere and do anything for peace, which is not a program. It is not a serious statement. It's a piece of rhetoric. And then, rather than taking this as the starting point, one side has come with a concrete proposal and roadmap. Then what we see is intensification of fighting, the Ethiopian government demanding that this issue not be addressed at the UN Security Council, and then a very vague set of proposals coming from the AU Commission about what it sees as a peace process, and one side clearly is serious about, which is the Tigrayans, about what a peace process should look like. And the African Union is simply not taking that seriously, and the international community, the international partners, are not holding up the African Union to its own standards. It has established high standards, the best practices for mediation, for conflict resolution. It has enshrined those in its norms, principles, and practices. And it's coming with a very sloppy, I may say, amateur pretense of a mediation, and nobody is calling them out on it. And it's discrediting the African Union, and it is undermining the standing of the international community as well.
Yeah, I think there is also, I think some players in the international community would ideally like to bypass the African Union for the exact reason that you mentioned. But I think there is a hesitancy to do that, because then that would be construed as imposing Western, will or that, because that's how the Ethiopian government has framed the whole argument, as a pan-Africanist argument and all that. So I think people have a hesitation to brush aside the African Union and create another venue for negotiation. I think that's part of the problem. But also, could it also be, has it occurred to you, Alex, to think that maybe the international community doesn't really care as long as the war in Tigray remains contained, as long as there are no. This is a very cynical take on my part, I would readily admit, but maybe could there be a factor of that maybe they don't care enough?
It's striking that much of the analysis that comes from the embassies in Addis Ababa, and we all know that there's a sort of bubble in Addis Ababa. They talk to each other and they create a sort of groupthink in Addis Ababa, which often bears very little relation to what happens in the rest of the country. I remember when I was a student talking to some of the those who had been diplomats at the time of the 1974 revolution, and none of them saw it coming. They were literally taken by surprise. And I remember visiting Addis Ababa in 1990 and early 1991, and the diplomatic community did not see the defeat of the Derg coming. It was only when the EPRDF could actually be heard in Addis Ababa, when the gunfire could be heard, that they thought, oh, there's a civil war, which is actually going to lead to a profound change. And so many of them, I think, are fairly oblivious to history and oblivious to the realities of how politics and the politics of civil war operates in and regime change operates in Ethiopia. There's this proven history of people clinging on to a doomed regime long after its sell-by date, and so the affection for Abiy Ahmed will not be the first time this has happened. I think there's also a sense, a misreading of the realities. I suspect that one of the things that's happened is the intelligence capabilities of Western nations have been switched off. They've been switched elsewhere, particularly to Ukraine, obviously. So they're not, fully aware of the scale of, first of all, the military buildup during August and the fighting. They seem to be oblivious to that. And so the narrative, the dominant narrative, is that Tigray will submit. Well, we know after this, 5 weeks of intense fighting, that hasn't happened, and there's no sign of it happening. And if it were to happen, there is we can see what the consequence would be, because we know who is running the war, and it's being run out of Asmara. And yet there is an extraordinary combination of overlapping blind spots there as to the realities of what is happening in Tigray and the north of Ethiopia, and the role of Eritrea. And it is as though the diplomats who are assigned to this only see their particular part of the issue. They cannot stand back and see the whole thing and where it is leading.
Well, yeah, interesting that you mentioned intelligence. One of the points that Mike Hammond made in one of his last press conferences was that the US had satellite imagery showing that there was buildup of Eritrean troops alongside the Tigrayan border. And of course, the US hadn't said anything until denying the involvement of Eritrea became impossible, not least because the Ethiopian government also readily conceded, or at the very least, they didn't officially deny that Eritrea was involved. So what seems to be happening to me is that they actually have the intelligence, they are switched on, but they don't, for some reason, some of the reasons you mentioned, don't want to act on the intelligence that they have. And also related to Eritrea, it looks like they are trying to toe 2 lines. On the one hand, they seem to be suggesting that Isaias and Eritrea are integrated at the invitation of Abiy. But on the other hand, and you pointed that out in one of the texts that you annotated, the Ethiopian officials seem to be telling foreign diplomats that they can't really do anything with Eritrea. Eritrea is on its own. What is your sense of what is happening in terms of Eritrea and in terms of the understanding of foreign envoys about Eritrea? They seem to be holding to contradictory views in my reading.
I think none of the foreign diplomats have truly faced the reality of Eritrea. Over the years, there's either been a tendency just to look away from Eritrea as a problem too difficult to solve, or to pretend that it is not what it is, and to ignore the well-known history, the record of Isaias Afwerki as a totalitarian, as a destabilizer, etc. And those errors of analysis are now becoming inescapable. And there is anybody who is aware of the record of Isaias and the way that he handles political and military affairs, and who is aware of the fact that a huge portion of the Ethiopian National Defense Force is now under the direct control, command and control of Asmara, has to recognize that something has gone terribly wrong on the assumption that Abiy is the good guy who was perhaps led into a unfortunate alliance with the bad guy Isaias. It's not like that. Isaias is running the show, and Abiy has willingly put his military capabilities at the disposal of Isaias, and if they were to prevail, it is Isaias who will prevail. Abiy will be his pawn. That decision was taken many weeks ago when those troops were deployed under Eritrean command before the eruption of fighting on the 24th of August.
Well, I think Isaias is running the show is a good way of putting the whole thing. But then it raises an interesting question, which is that one of the theories that many people seem to be advancing to explain why there is kind of hesitancy on the part of the international community to push for Abiy to negotiate with the Tigrans is because Abiy has promised a lot in terms of liberalization of Ethiopia to the international community. He has opened up a very lucrative market to different international actors. Because of the promise that he has made to them, they would like to keep him at any cost. And one of the costs they are ready to pay is the total destruction of Tigray. If that means that Abiy will be salvaged and kept. But then if Isaias is running the show, Isaias has not made his dislike of the West secret, and I think it's fair to conclude that if Isaias running the show, Ethiopia is not going to be attractive and conducive to the West. So how do you explain, and I think it's fair to say that this can't have been lost on the West, that Isaias is really running the show. Isaias is going to dictate matters, even if they were to have their way and destroy Tigray. And it's difficult to see how Ethiopia will continue to be an attractive market to them. How do you explain that? I don't know if I made myself clear.
You made yourself clear, but I think it can only be explained by a very poor analysis of the realities in Ethiopia and a very shallow understanding of what the Ethiopian state is and has become. I think the logic of this war is that it is a war that, unless it is stopped by some very, very powerful international diplomatic intervention, which is not in prospect at the moment, the logic of the war is it will be resolved when at least one, possibly two, possibly all three of the parties is destroyed. And the three parties are Eritrea, Tigray, and the federal government. And what we see now is that the federal government is essentially has no foundation. What are the pillars of government? Well, one is the core pillar of any government is the control over the means of violence. The state in Ethiopia has lost that. It has lost that definitively. And restoring that is going to be extraordinarily difficult. It's lost it because the main instrument of the federal government for using violence is now in the hands of Eritrea. And the other instruments are in the hands of the regional governments, be they the Amhara regional state, which is itself fragmented, the Oromos, which are themselves fragmented, etc. So that pillar of the state has gone. And it's not yet, that impact has not yet been felt in Addis. The economic viability of the state is perhaps not gone, but extremely precarious now. I mean, it has lost that developmental capability that it had until a few years ago. It is losing the administrative structure, the integrity of its basic institutions. And rebuilding those is going to be remarkably difficult. I mean, the reality is, and this is what the Eritrean leadership, was saying some 20, 25 years ago. They were saying Ethiopia is destined to be like Congo. They called it an overdressed Zaire after the time when the regime of Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire collapsed and Congo followed. And that is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so of those three, my argument would be that we are headed very rapidly towards state failure in Ethiopia. Now, the question is, what does that state failure look like? There are different scenarios for it. But unless it is arrested very soon, that future is inescapable. And then the question then is if the Ethiopian federal institutions are really ceasing to function in anything but name. Then which of the two will stand, Eritrea or Tigray? That is the fight. And if Eritrea prevails, we know what that entails. If Tigray prevails, then it's likely that Eritrea will collapse. And then, but in prevailing, we don't know what the human and political cost will be to Tigray. So we could see a situation in which there is no credible, no workable political authority anywhere in this region. And that is a totally foreseeable and logical outcome of the current trajectory.
Well, I think we'll come back to the nature of the state failure in Ethiopia now in a minute. But before that, I would like to ask you something that's kind of personal to you. Following the murder of Siyum Mesfin, the former foreign minister, and his comrades, you wrote a powerful eulogy, but also you paid tribute to the kind of thing that he had done in terms of bringing Ethiopia to the fore diplomatically, in terms of finding a workable balance with Sudan, for instance, in the Al-Fashaga Triangle, and all other things that he had done. But you also made a call to the international community saying that the murder of a former foreign minister is not a small matter, and that should wake up the international community as to the severity of the cruelties and atrocities that were being committed. And I think it's fair to say that those calls of yours and also of other people have gone unheeded. And I'm just wondering if the silence of the international community has shattered you believe in the global order and the international community, in the rule of law and in how they could be implemented and all those things. Has anything changed in the way you see things, Alex?
I think what we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years is a massive onslaught on the norms, principles, institutions of the multilateral order for peace and security, and a very weak defense of them, a very feeble defense. And we see that at the United Nations. We see that in Europe. We see that in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We also see it in the way in which the Western response to Ukraine has yet really to formulate a clear vision for what the peace should look like after this war in Ukraine. And then in Africa, we've seen a terrible retreat from those norms and principles that were foundational to the African Union some 25 years ago, that were forged in the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda, the spate of coups d'etat across West Africa, the terrible internationalized civil war in Congo. And at the turn of the millennium, the African leaders said, we cannot continue down this path. We need to turn around. And indeed, Africa did turn around. But what we're now seeing is a regression to the bad old days of the OAU, and the type of thinking that prevailed in the 1960s at the time of Biafra, at the time of the annexation of Eritrea by Haile Selassie, etc. And if we go down that road, then the principles that made Africa a hopeful continent are going to be trashed. And sadly, we, under the current African Union leadership, we are headed in that direction.
So, in terms of the nature of Ethiopia today that you briefly alluded to earlier, I think even people in Ethiopia, even pro Abiy and pro the government people now, do realize that something is amiss, and they see it reflected in the runaway inflation. They see it reflected in the fact that they can't really travel to places outside the capital city. But it does look like to me from afar that there doesn't seem to be an understanding in Ethiopia of the underlying reasons for why things are the way they are. And I think you were present last year when you described that Ethiopia could be in one of the 5 different states. I think you mentioned, maybe you'll correct me if I got them wrong, but you mentioned state contraction, state fragmentation, and you also mentioned state disassembly, and I think 2 other things that I can't recall from memory now, but surely you would know.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of what Ethiopia now is, Tigray, we could say, is kind of de facto country now. There is it's as divorced from Ethiopia as it could possibly be. Large areas of Oromia are unreachable from Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian government doesn't have control over them anyways. And there are pockets of places in Amhara region as well that the federal government can't really control, and a lot of things happening in the country. So where would you think Ethiopia as a country in relation to the different categorizations you described is?
Well, I think the basic error of analysis of so many in the diplomatic community is to mistake the continuity of a leader with the viability of the state. So, and this has happened before. I mean, the classic example being Siad Barre in Somalia after his defeat in the Ogaden War in 1978, stayed in power and presided over and indeed engineered the collapse of the Somali state. And there are other examples of leaders who have instrumentalized disorder and collapse in order to stay in power, Mobutu Sese Seko being one. And yet, the diplomatic formula is always, oh, we must stick with this man because the alternative is chaos, not realizing that actually this is what is generating the chaos, or refusing to recognize that and refusing to put in place the mechanisms that could actually save the country. This lesson has not, it seems, been learned. And Abiy Ahmed is a case in point. He was his mission of dismantling everything that came before, some of which certainly needed to be dismantled. But to dismantle something is not to build an alternative, and he hasn't built an alternative. Now, now I've said repeatedly, and you've said that Ethiopia is on the trajectory towards collapse. Now, what does that mean? And it's remarkable that over the last year we have not seen anyone in the international community that is engaged in Ethiopia with the sort of the intellectual resources that go into the types of political economic analysis that are standard for embassies, for aid missions, for the World Bank, and so on. No one has addressed the question, this challenge that I made in July of last year. What does the state collapse in Ethiopia look like? And as you say, I outlined different scenarios, of which I suggested the most likely one on the based on the history of Ethiopia, is state contraction, whereby the state is essentially no more than the capital city and a few other enclaves. Presumably the transport corridor to Djibouti and one or two other places like air bases and so on. And historically, there are many precedents for this. Emperor Menelik in 1906 was described in one sentence as being an absolute despot, and the other sentence as having no authority that extended more than one checkpoint outside Addis Ababa. And one can imagine, Abiy being in that mold, and Menelik, of course, was seen as a great emperor, a great leader, and Abiy could build the beautiful palaces like Menelik did, and portray himself to the world without having really any institutional administrative authority beyond the capital city and a few other places like the transport corridor to